What would you do if a medallion suddenly fell off a chain that was still completely closed around your neck? We saw it happen. Not once, but twice. And then, while we were trying to figure out how it was possible, my partner was mentally attacked. His mind suddenly flooded with some of the worst memories of his life. This was our fourth and final trip to Bob's house, and whatever had been there was waiting for us. But this time, it wasn't just trying to scare us, it was fighting back. Welcome back, everyone. We were on our way back, the fourth and what would be our final trip to Bob's house. It is now October 2016. On the way back to Bob's, we had already decided that this would be our last trip. If this didn't provide any answers or solutions, I was going to have that conversation with Bob about re-engaging the church. I'm not sure why he stopped working with them. I can only assume that he didn't want to keep bothering them. Bob was a very gentle, sweet man, and I could see him being the type of person who simply didn't want to keep calling and asking for help. If you missed part one, be sure to watch it first. It will give you the backstory, including what brought us to Bob's house and what happened during our previous 3 trips. On the way up, we went over our game plan. We discussed what we had done before, what seemed to work, what didn't, and which areas we wanted to concentrate on. And of course, that dreaded closet was at the top of our list. By this point, Bob had almost become family to us. After all the phone calls, conversations, and times we had spent in his home, we had gotten to know him pretty well. During our first visit, after the initial cleansing, we were concerned that something might retaliate after we left because of things Bob had experienced over the years. So we stayed overnight. While Bob and his family slept, we stayed up all night, fueled by caffeine, watching the cameras we had installed on the upper floors from a monitor downstairs. And surprisingly, the night was quiet. We heard a few creaks and noises here and there, but the house was built in 1910. Old houses make noises. Nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. When the sun came up and Bob woke up, we packed up and headed back to Virginia. It was a peaceful night. Unfortunately, this trip was going to start off anything but peaceful. As soon as we walked through the front door, the atmosphere felt different. The air felt so thick that I literally stopped in my tracks. It was almost as though whatever was there knew we were coming and was waiting for us as soon as we crossed over the threshold. We brought in some equipment and exchanged greetings with Bob and then headed upstairs to the master bedroom. And once again, we went straight to that dang closet. What happened next, you probably won't believe, because if I hadn't witnessed it myself, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But before I tell you what happened, there's something I want to share. We wear blessed Saint Benedict medallions during our cases, especially when we believe we may be dealing with something demonic. These aren't cheaply made. They aren't hanging from some thin, flimsy chain. They're very sturdy. And I want you to remember that because you're about to hear about 2 incidences that really test what you think you know. So as my partner started re-examining the closet, Bob was giving me the latest updates. A few moments later, I heard something hit the floor. It wasn't a loud crash. It was more of a small clink. I assumed my partner had moved something on a shelf and knocked something down. But that's not what happened. I looked over and saw him bend down and pick something up. A moment later, he turned around. He was holding his Saint Benedict medallion in his hand. At first I was confused. Then I noticed the look on his face. He was genuinely frightened. The medallion was what I had heard hit the floor. But there was one major problem. The chain was still around his neck, fully clasped. I took the medallion and started examining it. I wanted to see if the little O-ring had somehow loosened and allowed the medallion to slip off. It hadn't. The O-ring was still completely closed. I asked my partner to remove the chain so I could examine that too. It was a thick sterling silver chain. I couldn't see anything wrong with it. But here's the problem. Metal doesn't pass through metal. At least physics tells us it shouldn't. So I put the medallion back through the chain myself. Then I started moving it back and forth. I figured there had to be some tiny flaw somewhere. Maybe something on the medallion. Maybe something on the chain. Something that could explain how this happened. But the medallion didn't come off. I examined everything again. The chain, the medallion, the O-ring. Everything looked completely normal. So I decided to test it. With the medallion still attached to the chain, I grabbed the necklace and started repeatedly hitting it against the mattress. If there was some kind of flaw that allowed the medallion to slip through the chain, this should have reproduced it. I did this for probably 1 or 2 minutes. Nothing. The medallion stayed exactly where it belonged. There had to be something else, a weak point. Something that under just the right circumstances allowed it to happen. But we couldn't find it. So my partner put the necklace back on. We looked at each other, and I think we both had the same thought. What the heck just happened? Once the closet didn't give us anything new, my partner headed up into the attic to look around. I stayed in the master bedroom with Bob, continuing to discuss what had been happening. About 5 or 6 minutes later, I heard my partner coming back down the stairs from the attic. He stopped in the doorway. He looked directly at me and mouthed the words, "We have to go outside." The look on his face was unlike anything I had seen before. Early on, when we first started working together, we had actually established a code word, like a safe word, that either of us could use if we needed to step outside for a moment. The idea was to do it without alarming the client. But my partner was so shaken that he didn't even think about using the code word. And before I continue, let me tell you something about him. When I decided to concentrate more on private cases to help those being affected after a personal experience I had, he was on board to join me in my mission. This is how we started working together. He had already been doing paranormal investigations for about 20 years before I ever started. He started when he was probably in his late teens or early 20s, and nothing scared him. If there was a creepy attic, crawl space with spiders and bugs, he was the guy you sent in. I'm not going to say he was fearless, because I don't think anybody is completely fearless, but in the years I had known him, I have never seen him frightened like that. Now, Bob hadn't seen the look on his face because his back was to the door. So I simply told Bob, "Hey Bob, we're going to run out to the car and grab the rest of the equipment so we can get everything set up." Now, other than the strange incident with the medallion, I had no idea what had happened once my partner left the bedroom and went into the attic. We stepped outside. I looked at him and asked, "What's wrong?" And that's when he told me he had been mentally attacked, relentlessly. Whatever was in that house had started pushing memories from his entire life to the forefront. Bad memories, sad memories, things he had experienced that he didn't want to think about. And then it started telling him he was worthless, and it just kept going. It was almost as though there was a megaphone inside his head constantly repeating every negative experience of his life. Now, I felt terrible for him. Like I said, I had never seen him like that before. We stood outside for probably 15-20 minutes while I tried to calm him down. I told him that whatever was in that house seemed to have been waiting for us when we arrived. And I had a feeling this was probably how the rest of the night was going to go. At that point, I started putting the pieces together. There had been the medallion incident, but then there was the mental attack on my partner, and I started wondering if maybe he was a target. So I told him, tonight I'm going to do all the communication. He could hold the camera and stay with me, but he wasn't going to ask any questions. We were going to see if changing the approach made any difference. Since we'd been outside for a while, Bob was getting worried. I told him we were just working out our game plan and that we'd be back in shortly. I didn't tell him what had happened to my partner. So a few minutes later, we went back inside with the new plan. We got all the equipment set up and decided to start in the master bedroom. And of course, that dreaded closet. My partner stood about 5 feet away from me with the camera pointed at me as I sat on the corner of the bed. Just as we discussed, he wasn't asking any questions. I was doing all the talking. Here are some of the responses we initially got.
Spirits are in this room with me right now. Can you give me a number? If you have a problem with Will, can you turn that flashlight on or make that device flicker? Which room are they in?
Then my partner suddenly spoke up. He said, "Something just tugged on my shirt collar." Now, I was still trying to process what happened earlier with the medallion, but my first thought was that maybe his chain or shirt had shifted when, he was holding the camera and moving. Maybe he was simply hypersensitive after what had happened earlier, although that was not like him. I wasn't ready to jump to a paranormal explanation yet. And then, about a minute later, I was proven wrong. Yeah, I hate when that happens. I was looking directly at him while I continued asking questions, and then I saw it. The medallion fell from his chain and hit the floor, right in front of me. Once again. Metal does not pass through metal. We stopped the Q&A session and he handed me the medallion. I checked the O-ring, still perfectly closed. The chain was still around his neck. He removed it and handed it to me, and once again I started looking for an explanation. I examined that chain relentlessly, put the medallion back through it. Then I did exactly what I had done earlier. Holding the chain in my hand, I started pounding it against the mattress for about, 4 or 5 minutes. But the medallion would not come off. At this point, it was becoming pretty clear that whatever was happening seemed to be focused on my partner. I was wearing the exact same type of medallion. Nothing had happened to mine. So I suggested we try something. We switched. I took off my medallion and chain and gave them to him. Then I put his on, and we started the QA again. One of the first questions I asked was, did a demon rip this medallion off of my partner's neck? And here was the response.
Did a demon rip this medallion off of Will's neck?
Then I asked, it's on my neck now. Are you going to come rip it off of me now? And here was the response.
It's on my neck now. Are you going to come rip it off of me now?
And after that, everything stopped. I don't know if whatever was there realized that its tricks weren't going to work on us anymore, but from the moment we walked through that front door, it had made its presence known, then went after my partner and the 2 incidents with the medallions, all within the first hour or 2 of arriving, and then nothing. It was as though everything had simply disappeared. Well, we continued through the house looking for anything else. Everything was quiet. But that left us with one question. Where did it go? Bob lived in a townhouse, so we wondered if whatever was happening could have somehow moved into one of the neighboring units. The townhouse to the left was occupied by a family. Bob had spoken with them over the years, and they said nothing ever unusual happened there. But the townhouse to the right was vacant, and it was actually on the market. Bob had a key because the realtor would, contact him sometime if someone wanted to come see the property. So Bob opened the door and let us in. We searched the entire townhouse, all 3 levels, floor by floor, room by room, and nothing. No feeling that anything had moved there. We went back to Bob's townhouse and walked through it again just to see if anything had returned, and it hadn't. After about an hour of nothing happening, we decided it was time to move forward with the prayers and cleansing. Once that was completed, we packed up and headed back to Virginia. But we knew this probably wasn't the end. I decided I would wait for Bob to call me with an update. Then I would have the conversation I'd been putting off. It was time to get the church involved again. I don't remember exactly how long it was before I heard from Bob. It may have been a few weeks, but eventually he called. The activity was happening again, so I had that conversation with him. I told him that he really needed to get the church involved again. An earlier priest had told him something that had always stuck with me. Whatever was there felt like it had a right to be there. Bob had moved into that house in 1982, and activity started a few years later. And, we already know that the previous tenants had apparently put a lock on the outside of one of the bedroom doors. So who knows what happened there before Bob ever moved in. He may not have been the first person affected. But whatever was there seemed to be deeply rooted in that townhouse, or possibly even the land itself. And at this point, I truly believed it was going to take an exorcist to remove it. So Bob contacted the church and they agreed to help. According to Bob, it took the exorcist 3 visits before the activity was finally gone. Of course, we don't know exactly what it was. We don't know how it got there, and we don't know why it was there. Was it something somebody had done years earlier? Was it connected to the land? Were the graves Bob had wondered about really completely relocated? At this point, all of that is speculation. We never got a definitive answer. But there was one thing we did know. The activity stopped, and Bob was finally in a good place again. As far as the medallions, no further issues after that night. So, what did we learn from this case? Well, apparently, physics got it wrong. Metal can pass through metal. I'm kidding, of course. But that incident is something you don't forget. There was another important lesson here. If you have something serious going on in your home, especially if you're dealing with what you believe may be something demonic, and you have a priest or pastor willing to help you, work with them. It may not be resolved in one visit. In Bob's case, it took the exorcist 3 visits before the activity finally stopped. And if you're part of a non-Catholic church, make sure the pastor you're working with actually has experience dealing with these kinds of situations, because not every church does. Not every pastor will know how to approach it. But if you found someone who does, don't walk away from that relationship. It can be difficult to get a church involved sometimes. But if you have someone willing and able to help, keep working with them. And third, for all that is holy, put the sage down. It doesn't work. Now there's one other question I want to address. Why did it go after my partner and not me? I don't know for certain, but I've always had a theory. I believe these things tend to go after what I refer to as the weakest link. And I mean that respectfully. If my partner had something going on in his personal life that was weighing heavily on his mind, maybe he wasn't at 100%. And if that's the case, whatever was in that house may have picked up on it immediately. I've always had a rule for myself. If I'm going through something personally that makes me less than 100%, I don't investigate. I'll either wait or reschedule until I'm in a better place. Because when we walk into these locations, I don't picture demons the way Hollywood does, like horns and pitchforks. I think of them more like schoolyard bullies. They look for weakness. They look for the moments when someone is vulnerable, and they take advantage of it. Thanks for watching, and remember, seek the truth, not the fear.